Good evening. Welcome back to the 2015 Open Lecture Series. It's gone 6 o'clock, so I'm going to make a start. A bit echoey. We haven't got any AV people tonight. I think it must be the cutbacks. So it's just down to Ilka, who's doing a great job, Ilka. So we're going to kick off the year with a very special event. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you tonight to my colleague and friend, Professor Malcolm McIntosh, to talk about his new book, hot off the press, Thinking the 21st Century Ideas for the New Political Economy. Before I go into an overview of what you can expect this evening, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting this evening. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present, and indeed extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who are here today. Malcolm McIntosh is well known to all of you, I suspect, in this room tonight, and it's great to see you coming in such large numbers. It's no surprise, by the way, but I'm sure you're going to be very interested to learn about this new volume. For those of you who don't know Malcolm, let me tell you a little bit about him. He's the founding director of the Asia Pacific Centre for Sustainable Enterprise. He's been teaching and writing on the subjects of corporate responsibility and sustainability for a very long time now, since 1990. He's worked at a number of universities around the world, in the UK, universities of Warwick and Coventry. He's been a visiting prof in numerous places, again in the UK, Bath and Bristol, but also Stellenbosch in South Africa, Waikato and Sydney, closer to home. And he's the producer, author and co-author of more than 20 books and numerous articles. I think it's actually 28, Malcolm, isn't it? 28 books. Some people haven't read that many. Frequent commentator on television and radio around the world on social issues, business responsibility and sustainable enterprise. And he's been special advisor to the UN Global Compact, and he was the founding editor of the Journal of Corporate Citizenship. So a little bit about the book. What Malcolm does in this book is to question the current model of capitalism. He calls for a much-needed new order, and in laying out his blueprint, he puts forward 5 system changes that he believes are essential to building a new political economy. Now, I'm not going to go into any great detail about the content of the book. Suffice to say that interspersed in the numerous paragraphs that he writes, he says things like, a critical moment in the history of the world is upon us. The future survival of mankind and the earth itself is in our hands at this very moment in time. Elsewhere he says, the way we organise ourselves as humans on planet Earth is undergoing massive disruption just now. Our organisations and institutions are inexorably changing. And elsewhere, we have come to a critical juncture where awe and wonder have been marginalised by science, modernity, technology, consumerism and neoliberal economics. And finally, evolutionary success and human survival depends on our ability to learn and our ability to adapt through learning. The way we learn and our approach to education will determine our chances of survival. And before I hand over to Malcolm, I'll just read out a few of the comments that have been made about this book already, beginning with George Kell, Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. Quote, thinking the 21st century provides fresh perspectives on the world that could be, where people and communities take centre stage. This book is both timely and urgent as humanity struggles to seek solutions for a fairer and sustainable future. Sarah Parkin, founder director of the Forum for the Future, she says, a page-turner that synthesises the thinking about why we need to change and how it might come about. And finally, Jane Nelson, director of the CSR initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School, she writes, this wonderful book should be required reading for anyone who cares about building the new types of cross-sector and multidisciplinary leadership skills, institutional structures and partnerships that are so urgently needed to drive more inclusive and sustainable prosperity. And one final comment, really, really quite good, Jeremy Williams, Griffith University. Over to you, mate.
Are we rolling? Okay. No.
Sorry. It'll be right. Yep, should be right now.
Okay.
Yep.
It's got a terrible echo on it, actually. Can we turn it down a bit?
Yeah.
Okay. I think after Jeremy's introduction, I ought to just sit down because I think he said everything that the book says. Thanks, Jeremy. I was going to start actually by talking about Jeremy. By way of tribute to him, he's just stood down as the director of the Asia Pacific Centre for Sustainable Enterprise because he wanted to do something worthwhile. Now, that's my joke. I'm probably going to get it wrong, but he stood down because he got frustrated with the university bureaucracy and wanted to do something practical. No, he's going to say there's other things, but I'm being kind to him. But he's going off to set up a chain of green schools for girls across Southeast Asia. I put the grandest title to it. And I just wanted to start at this point, Jeremy, and wish you well. Fantastic venture, education for girls and green education for girls as well. So it's a great thing. So can I, even though I won't be here, invite you back in a year's time or 2 years' time to tell us how it's going? Some of you were at a talk I gave about 6 or 7 months ago when I talked a little bit about this book before it had gone to the sub-editors and before it had gone out for review. So I apologise for about 6 of you who've heard a little bit of the second half of this. This book was inspired by a number of things. The first one, I suppose, is an academic point and hence part of the title, the second part of the title. I should say, by the way, how nice it is to see so many old friends here. Some of you I've known for a very long time. One person for 30 years. More than 30 years, I think. And then others I've met in strange places. This man at the back, I last met him at St Pancras Station by chance. And there are other people here as well. It's nice to see so many old friends. Thank you. So the intellectual starting point for this book was a report that was written for a high-level panel to the UN Secretary-General prior to the Rio +20 conference. That panel had people like Gro Harlem Brundtland on it. It also had a man that we've all forgotten called Kevin Rudd. About 20 very eminent people, people who've been in the world of sustainable development for 20, 30, 40 years. And one of the things they called for was a new political economy. When you buy the book, you'll be able to read the quote in full. But in particular, they called for a new political economy because they wanted to debase the way Western universities in particular work. They wanted to debase the atomization of knowledge, and they wanted people to talk to each other across disciplines. So one of my starting points is transdisciplinarity. I think the quote they actually made was they wanted environmentalists and scientists and politicians to stop talking past each other, which is quite a nice and useful image. So that's an intellectual starting point. My use of transdisciplinarity, though, is polymathic, and I make references to all sorts of things which make me a very ill-disciplined academic in this context, in that I refer to music and love and poetry and political science and science, etc., throughout the book, which seems to have pleased the reviewers, but may not please those of you who are straight-line academics who think that people shouldn't be postmodern in terms of their search for knowledge. I could also start with this picture here, which is the cover of the book. We only have 7 copies left, I think, because I've been selling them today. Some of you may know that this is a sculptor called Anthony Gormley. You may have heard of him. This is at Sefton, just outside Liverpool, and this is the Liverpool docks in the UK in the background here. And these are wind turbines, of course. And as you look at Anthony Gormley's sculptures, you can see the ships coming out and engaging in global trade. And of course, Liverpool's wealth, a lot of Liverpool's wealth came from the slave trade when it moved from Bristol because the port was too shallow to Liverpool. Liverpool became the centre of slave trade, but it's also where a lot of people left to go and live in America and Australia over the years. Anthony Gormley is a sculptor, and there are 100 of these life-size pieces modelled on his body. So this is his body, and they go out to sea. And you can walk for several kilometres. And they're slowly eroding as the tide comes in and out, and some of them are covered in barnacles, and some of them are eroding slowly, and some of them are rusting. It seems to me a marvellous image or metaphor for the way we are at the moment. Here we have world trade, here we have future energy, here we have man. In this case, I'm using it in the generic sense, and he is a man. All his bits are there, staring out to sea and watching and wondering. And there is a plaque at the beginning that says, this is a time to wonder and reflect on where we've got to and how we got to where we got to. And that is one of the main themes of the book, which is about adaptation, evolution, and learning. We live in a world where we have thought that we could arrive at mechanistic or instrumental answers to the many questions we face, but perhaps the answers actually lie in us understanding evolution rather better, and certainly understanding adaptation. So part of the book is a plea for reflection and quiet in a very busy world. Have you all got your phones turned off? Nobody I see on Facebook at the moment. If you teach a class here, you can expect at least half the class not to be on people reaching for their phones quickly. Probably be mine that goes off. So that's one of my starting points. The other starting points were that I have no fear. This is my 27th book, I think. And all of the other books have been worthy, and most of them haven't been transdisciplinary. And at this time, I thought I didn't mind if I referenced from Bob Dylan to Billy Bragg to John Ruggie to Hobbes to Karl Marx to Adam Smith, etc., in one volume to see what happened. As it happens, the reviewers have been extremely kind to me, as Jeremy evinced. So that's the second part. The third part is that having had a background of 30 years in both academia but also engagement in corporate responsibility initiatives and in sustainability initiatives, often much the same thing, I wanted to reflect on what I had learnt from that and where we had come to. So we'll come back to this point about a sense of failure, but also a sense of moving on. So the book is most certainly about change, and I'll reflect on that in a little while, and it's certainly about uncertainty. But I also wanted to knock on the head the idea of miserablism. A lot of the ways in which we have tried to tell people about the way the world is and about climate change and about sustainability is to scare them and there's a word that comes after that, but is to put fear into them and to make it sound as if we're at an apocalyptic moment. And we are at a difficult moment, I don't have any doubt about that. But I also argue that if we had a greater sense of history and a greater sense of our evolutionary past, we would know that every age thinks that it's an apocalyptic moment. There have been periods of peace and then periods of great change. This is a period of great change, but I don't think necessarily that challenges that we face now are necessarily any worse or any greater than they have been in the past. Humanity has always needed a sense that things need to change, need to happen. One of the differences now is that we can see things in a global perspective, and we have almost too much information at the moment. We have an information overload, so certainly a large amount of confusion as to what we should or shouldn't understand, and then how we might understand that. So I'm not in any sense in this book negating what is said about any of those things: climate change, sustainability, development, population, economics, etc. But I am calling for a greater sense of reflection, and certainly the book concludes in the last chapter, which is about education essentially, in that because of a 24/7 social media world, we're actually losing our ability to reflect and be still and look back and understand how we got to where we've got to. And that's supported by quite a lot of research in that area. So I want to reflect on all of those things. The title of the book I unashamedly stole from one of my heroes. For those of you who are political scientists, you will have heard of Tony Judd, who was a lecturer both at the University of London and New York University, who wrote a book just before he died about 2 years ago called Thinking the 20th Century, in which he sat down with an American economist called Timothy Snyder, who, by the way, was on Radio National the other night, 2 nights ago. You may have heard him. And Timothy and Tony talked about the history of the 20th century, and it got transcribed into a wonderful book called Thinking the 20th Century. Now, they had the benefit of hindsight. I have the problem of foresight, so I'm looking forward. But that's where the title comes from, Thinking the 21st Century, and the ideas for a new political economy I've just told you about. So the book is also quite personal, and I did it again as a different piece of neo-academic writing, and I wrote a lot of it in cafes and bars and places all over the world. So you'll find me sitting in cafes in Shanghai and London, etc., because I've unashamedly spent the last 30 years flying around the world. I have the largest carbon footprint in the world, maybe, apart from Martin. So a lot of it is very much about a journal. It's very much me reflecting on where I am and then trying to find theory from that and put it into the book and then extemporize on that. So it's a mixture of all those things. So it contains a lot of very personal messages. Some of them you'll be rather surprised and maybe a little shocked at. But never mind, it's a different sort of book. And as I say, the reviewers seem to like it. So the other thing that I've tried to do in the book, and I try to get my PhD students to do, and I'm looking at Susan at the back because we had supervision this afternoon, is to think about narrative. Now, how do you write a good story? And all academia is a good story. Some academics can't write good stories at all. It's terrible. Awful stuff. So what I've tried to do as a former journalist as well is to see if I can tell a story that works as well as using evidence. So it's a different sort of book. Excuse me. So let's move on. That's, as it were, my premise for writing the book and how I wrote the book as a different experience. I'm going to talk just a little bit in a moment about framing the 21st century. Then I'm going to talk about the 5 systems changes that the book talks about briefly. And then I'm going to talk about where this goes next. That's the structure of what we're doing, and I've got about another 20 minutes to go, haven't I? 25 minutes to go, something like that. So how should we frame the 21st century, given that that's the title of the book? One of the things that I argue is that unless we can learn from the 20th century and much further back, going back millions of years, we're not likely to solve the problems of the 21st century. Indeed, I argue at this moment where our brains are being morphed and connected into machines that we forget our evolutionary past at our peril. We forget that we need to sleep and eat and do all those other things, whilst at the same time our brains are whirring and are trying to adapt to a whole range of a blitz of media that's happening to us on a continuous basis. So, for instance, you will have noticed that there is only one PowerPoint slide advertising the book. I'm not going to use any other PowerPoint slides. This country, Australia, has a particularly proud, long tradition of yarning or telling stories. So I'm telling you a story. Hopefully I can hold your attention for 40 minutes. But some of you will be so used to having visual images all the time flashed at you. Have you noticed in some cafes and pubs and things, there's continuous flashing of images? There's one just outside the door here. I hate it. I hate it. We need to be able to tell stories about the past and the future. We need to engage people. We need to make real eye contact rather than just flashing screens. That's what I'm hoping to do. One of the things that I was allowed to do as a privilege as an academic was to spend quite a lot of time reading people that I'd read before, but I wanted to read again. So I did go back and read Charles Darwin again and Karl Marx and Adam Smith and a whole range of people. You'll see them listed in the book. And I discovered that some of them could write really rather well. I mean, Charles Darwin is a good read, even now. Even Karl Marx, actually, it's a good read. It's interesting. And then there were other people who turned out to be exemplary reads. Rachel Carson, you may have heard of, wrote Silent Spring, published in 1962, referenced throughout the book. That's 50-something years ago now, isn't it? Marvellous read. She could write. So the book also calls for a re-establishment in education of what we don't do in universities, the re-establishment of polymaths, or what I call again natural philosophers. It was quite reasonable for somebody like Charles Darwin to be both a brilliant scientist and a social reformer at the same time. It was quite common. And that was also quite easy for Einstein to do, where he talked about spirituality as well as science at the same time. We don't actually run any courses where we try to develop people to be polymaths or to be natural philosophers. Now, in fact, we don't like this. The idea that you might step outside your discipline and comment on something connected to it is not something that we approve of in universities. In fact, you get very few points in universities, reward points for writing across a number of disciplines. And you get very few points in universities for writing with other people outside your discipline. It's very, very difficult to have teamwork-based articles. And most of my 27 books I've written with other people, not this one. So I know all about how you don't score points on that. If you go back and read not just the 3.86 billion years of Earth evolution, but also the several million years of human evolution, and you start thinking about it, you come back to what David Cannadine, whom you may know, historian, UK historian, published a brilliant book a year or two back. He talks about our undivided past, that actually dividing ourselves from other people is part of what it means to be human. In fact, it's what gives us the sense of undivided past, is the sense of the other, that there are people in different tribes or religions or groups or genders or whatever. And that is one of the most important points that you find as soon as you start reading beyond, oh goodness me, how long do people think back? 5 years, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, etc. So that's a book, that's a second, third book that I would very much recommend. So how should we frame this century? I've already said that I don't think that the apparent apocalypses that we face now are necessarily any worse than the previous eras, but I do argue in the book that we know more about the state of the planet than we've ever known before. And I do argue, importantly for myself as a social scientist, that trust, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary trust, is absolutely crucial. I'm a social scientist. My title here was something to do with sustainable enterprise. People ask me questions about climate change science and sustainability all the time. I have to pretend that I understand the science, otherwise I have no credibility. Do I understand the science? Yes, I understand the science as far as I understand the science. And that, I see a number of you nodding. It's very rare that if I asked, and I'm not going to do it here because there are two people who would just immediately put their hands up, but if you get a group of 100 people anyway and say, can you just explain in a couple of sentences climate change or the difference between climate and weather or global warming, etc., actually the science becomes very complex very quickly, which is why, of course, the message gets abused by the media and politicians. So I have to trust my climate change colleagues, and I have to read what they write, and I have to, having read it, understand the consensus of their message in order for me to have a message and connect it to the issues that I do know a little bit about. So that issue of trust and science is, I think, absolutely fundamental to the notion of transdisciplinarity, and we've lost a lot of that, of course, as well, if you think of the discourse that goes on. Very important. So I'm indebted to my climate change scientists, just as I'm indebted to people like Jeremy, who's an economist. He's I don't know how he would describe himself, an ecological economist, an alternative economist, sometimes a green economist, something like that, etc. So actually that bond between me and other people as to how we're doing things is very, very important for this subject area. And I think that trust is easily eroded. So the 20th century is a challenge for us actually to work together. And this isn't my title, but I could have used a title which I think is going to become common, that this has to be the collaborative century. And I mean collaborative not just in a transdisciplinary sense, but between nations, between peoples who haven't met each other, are never going to meet each other. We have perhaps, as I say in the book, moved from originally Pax Britannica or Pax European to Pax Americana, and now this is the era, isn't it, of Pax Interdependence. And we know far more about this, about transboundary air pollution, for instance, or about trade flows than we ever did before. These are irrefutable, these numbers, these figures, these ways of seeing the world. It doesn't matter, as I say in the book, whether you go to the CIA annual handbook, which is a very good source, by the way, of accurate information, or whether you go to UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, texts as well to get information. Actually, they all correlate. One of the best sources actually for this sort of area is the World Economic Forum, which for my non-capitalist friends is, you can't cite a source like that, but you can't cite the CIA, but yes, you can actually. Some very accurate and good information about the state of the world. So we know far more than we did. And of course, one of the great discussions is about the end of the nation state. How should we negotiate this century then if the nation state is in abeyance, if it's falling apart, if its boundaries no longer exist, but it is actually the only model that we have. Territorial jurisdiction is the only way we have of making any agreements. So how does that connect with ISIS or with Facebook? Facebook having claimed that it's the second largest nation in the world, if it counts the number of people who are signed up to Facebook. You saw that advert, you may have seen that a little while ago, etc. So part of the book is also about how we rethink how we're connected, which is really very different from 20 or 30 years ago. Very different from the way in which we negotiated the post-Second World War agreements, the Bretton Woods agreements. So my 5 systems changes that I think are crucial, and I've argued that these systems changes, are that they're inevitable, that they're happening, that they're going to happen anyway, and that they are happening even if you don't recognise them. So they're ineluctable and they're nascent. They're nascent in that they're bubbling under and they're going to happen. They're ineluctable in that they have their own momentum and they're going to happen. So they're not only necessary, but they're happening anyway, whether you like it or not. And having given bits of this talk at different venues around the world over the last couple of years while I tested some of the theories, there are some bits of it which receive rapturous applause, and then there are some people who are very opposed to some of the things I'm saying. So I find that debate quite interesting in itself. But the first systems change is an easy one. If you look at the history of ideas and the history of change, it actually takes many decades, often a century or so, for people to take on board the idea of a new idea, whether it be the telephone or the steam engine, or the idea of global trade, or look at the Silk Route, you know, nutmeg coming across the world and becoming a hot commodity, etc. And I wanted to argue that even though we talk about globalization and this globe, and we have lots of language around this, that actually this as an image, as an idea, is very, very new. It's only since 1968 that we have a picture, a photograph of the planet from outside looking back. Do you know Fred Hoyle, the man who invented black clouds? He was also a science fiction writer, very good actually, wrote a science fiction book called The Black Cloud. So dark holes, etc. And he said in 1948, as soon as we have a picture of the Earth from outside, it's going to change the way we see the world. 1968, he said, now we have it. This is going to change the way in which we see the world. Now, I argue that this is very, very recent. That actually we're still coming to terms with the fact that we can see ourselves from outside. And the first photographs of the Earth from above were a French photographer, Nadar, in the mid-19th century, who got in a hot air balloon above Paris and took photographs looking down. This was the first time we'd been able to look at ourselves from somewhere else. And Will Self, the novelist, says this is a very interesting psychic moment, that you can see yourself from somewhere else. If you can imagine that you've never seen a mirror before. There was a bird outside here actually looking at itself in the mirror just now, pecking the glass. If you can imagine that you haven't seen yourself from that far away, I think that that's a change-making moment in the history of the universe. And of course, the first picture appeared on the front of the Earth catalogue. Do you remember that? The Earth catalogue, Stuart Brand, which is a book which had how to build a teepee, how to do public speaking, how to run a revolution, how to build a nuclear bomb. Do you remember this? And Steve Jobs described this as the beginning of the internet because it had everything in it. He had a picture of this on the back of his door, apparently. So first, the point is I want to rescue a particular word, and that word is globality. And globality, if you look it up, is deemed to be the end point of neoliberal economics. In other words, it's when we all share the same markets and we all eat McDonald's. I want to rescue that word and say that globality is the point at which we understand, we share, and we can see and we can feel in our hearts that we live on one shared planet. So I want to rescue that word. So that's my first system change. I think that's happening, but it's slow, and you can't expect it to just happen like that, and it will take a while, along with other major shifts in humanity's perception of itself. The second one, I've already alluded to, is that we live in a world where apparently there are answers to everything. We live in a very technocratic age where it's possible to come up with an answer. I bet all of you have been somewhere at some point and somebody says, I'll just Google that. And then you have apparently instant information. Apparently you believe the instant information as well, and that's the answer. Almost the end of the problem, sort of thing. We can do that very fast all the time. But this is true of absolutely everything. There is apparently a rational, technical answer for absolutely any problem you can throw at anybody else at the moment. And I think that we've forgotten actually to reflect. We've forgotten the idea. I use the word awe in the book. Some people would talk about wonder. So I talk about rebalancing science and awe. You know that old idea that you'll say, I'll just sleep on it? I think it's the best way to make decisions, actually. But I've made this joke before, so I apologise for a couple of you, but there's a joke made by an organisational change guy at MIT in the US, Peter Senge, who says, the problem is if you sit cross-legged on the floor of your office and your boss knocks on the door and says, what are you doing? And you say, I'm waiting for an answer to arrive, you'll probably get the sack. Because that's not how you're supposed to work, is it? You're given a problem, you're supposed to solve it, you're supposed to get on with it. You're not supposed to say, actually, I don't know. I'll come back, I'm just going to reflect on that, etc. And how many of you meditate when you're at work? Not a lot of us, not a lot of us. I have to admit, for the first time, I've given hundreds of talks in public. For the half an hour before I did this, I was lying on the floor in somebody's office upstairs. But I've never done it before. So if I appear to be speaking slightly slower than I normally do, Jeremy, it's because I nearly went to sleep on the floor upstairs. That's number two, is the rebalancing of science and awe is re-establishing, and Einstein said this. Einstein said, it doesn't matter whatever it is that I think I've discovered. Actually, the thing that I know most about now is the fact that I don't know very much. And I only know that because of silence and reflection. And that, he said, is the greatest joy in life, is to know that you don't know. And of course, many Indian philosophers in the Vedas have been saying the highest form of knowledge is to know that you don't know. Well, we've forgotten that ability actually in schools and universities. So, well, actually, I don't know. And academics never say, I don't know, because then their credibility is shot to say, actually, I don't know. I'll go away and come back and think about it. So that's my second point. Third point, which is perhaps slightly more controversial, I argue that at this point in the history of humanity, the world is more peaceful than it's ever been before. And some people go, you must be joking. How's that? How can that be? But actually, if you look at all the statistics, it doesn't matter what it is, infant mortality, longevity, people living in poverty, number of people living in semi-democratic regimes, they're all better now than they've ever been before. The reason why most people are confounded by this and say, you must be joking, is because we're bombarded with images of violence all the time. And I don't just mean Hollywood features. I mean, if somebody, we were talking about this today, weren't we, Chris, wherever you are? If somebody's beheaded now, you get the picture. It's a global picture immediately. Well, actually, those beheadings have been going on forever. It's just that you didn't get the pictures. You can only now get the pictures. It's only the last 10 or 20 years. So I'm not diminishing facts, which my wife keeps reminding me, that actually violence against women is on the increase. It is on a global basis. I'm not diminishing misogyny, and I'm not diminishing the fact that 1/3 of the planet still lives on less than $1 or $2 a day at all. But actually, if you look at the trends, I argue that we're doing remarkably well. Actually, we're doing much better than the miserabilists would have us believe. So this is another point at which I want to knock miserabilism on the head, and I want to focus on what's called positive deviancy, where you look at what works and say, how can we use that to go forward to solve the problems, rather than saying, this is an apocalyptic future, we're all stuffed. Which, if those of you who've read people like Plimer, Martin Rees, Slavoj Žižek, you know, this philosopher, etc., Living in the End Times, Man's Last Century, etc. These are the titles of books, Requiem for a Species, etc. I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm not a miserabilist. It's not that I don't respect their arguments. It's not that I don't understand the science of climate change, and it is terrible if you look at it and analyse it. But I think that if we focus on evolution, adaptation, and our ability to learn as a species, and our ability to adapt, you come to a conclusion which says that it's possible to get out of this mess, albeit with several billion people dying in the process. But look, you're all going to die anyway, folks. So I argue that we need to be much more positive, and we need to focus on what we can learn about adaptation. And that brings me back to rereading Charles Darwin, who never talked about the survival of the fittest. By the way, that was paraphrased by a Daily Telegraph journalist, not the one in Australia, the one in Britain, who was looking to paraphrase what the man had said. When he talked about adaptation, he said, of course, you've got to be fit and healthy, etc., to survive, but there are other characteristics which are also important. One of them is luck. Just being in the right place at the right time actually helps you survive. But the other one is cooperation with others. This is a key indicator of your ability to survive, but also your ability to learn. He talked about learning. So he talked about evolution, adaptation, and learning. And people seem to forget that. And we're all incredibly lucky in this room because you're all here because apparently you're learners and your ability to adapt is pretty good. Some of you have given up smoking in your lifetimes, haven't you? Some of you have given up red meat and alcohol. just a few of you. So I wanted to focus much more on that, and some of the reviews of sending the book out have said, fantastic, let's stop looking at mechanistic, instrumental approaches to things that we can solve it by just doing this or techno fixes, and let's focus much more on learning about the past, about adaptation and learning and changes in consciousness. And this peacefulness, I argue, also is a concomitant with the idea of globality. That if you have a sense, an emotional and physical sense of one shared space, in order to protect this one shared space, you need a nurturing, sharing, caring, cooperative, collaborative ethic. You need that approach to life. I've argued in the book that this is what I call the feminization of governance or decision making, that actually women know that it takes cooperation to raise a child, it takes a village, whereas a masculine approach to life is much more competitive, pioneering, aggressive, etc. Now, some people think that I'm talking about the gender war, and I'm absolutely not. I'm talking about feminization and masculinity. I'm talking about yin and yang, and I'm talking about balancing them. I'm saying we need creativity and enterprise on one side, and we need collaboration, cooperation, mutuality, sharing and caring on the other. This is a very important distinction. And my friend Jeremy here thinks I ought to be talking about the demasculinization of governance rather than the feminization of governance. So there's a great debate we've been having about the use of language. And there are some men. So what's all this stuff about feminization, Malcolm? I push prams. I'm a nice bloke. I do the washing up, etc. And then there are some feminists on the other side who say, how dare a man co-opt the language? So it's been quite a good debate. But I hope that you get my point, that in order to understand and protect this thing here, we need this to be the collaborative century. We cannot have a century which is misogynistic, which is aggressive, which doesn't understand protecting natural resources, which doesn't understand the science of climate change, etc. We have to have a century. And I argue, I've used the title, The Feminization of Global Governance and Decision Making. Read the book. You can enter the debate quite happily. But I do argue that we live in a very masculine world, an aggressive world. And if you look at all the anthropological research in this area, of which there's quite a lot, then a country like Australia, a country like Japan comes out as very masculine, and some other cultures come out as much more cooperative and feminine. You can go and investigate that. And I give a lot of evidence for the way in which men make decisions and the way women make decisions. But what I'm really interested in is feminizing everybody. So there are quite a lot of women who have very masculine features. Now, Margaret Thatcher is a good example of that. And there's quite a lot of men who actually are nurturers, carers, collaborators as well. So I don't want this to be a gender war. I want us all to rebalance in terms of yin and yang. So I hope that's clear. And that's why I'm talking about feminization and masculinity, not men and women. Although we have to start by helping women to be much more part of society because of what I've just said. I know I'm running over a bit, but you don't mind, do you? My next systems point is that if everything that I've said is true, then our institutions and our organisations are not fit for purpose now. And I mean all of them. And particularly having spent 30 years trying to reform the corporation or business. And not just corporations and businesses, this is true of universities and public bodies as well. All our organisations are not going to be able to deliver on the 3 systems changes that I've already talked about. Because they're all, whether they're universities or private organisations, using the Earth's resources in a way that isn't sustainable, that doesn't fit with this. And most of our organisations are run on masculine, hierarchical grounds as well. So we actually need to change the way in which we manage. So this chapter isn't called reorganising, it's called reorganising. So it looks at institutions and organisations and what we need to do to change them. But it particularly argues that the one system that we absolutely have to change is the model of capitalism that we have. the neoliberal model of capitalism that we've just had 20 years of experimentation with, that has been a complete failure. And there's quite a strong argument that an Earth-centric sense of economics, its real clash of civilizations is neoliberal economics and pioneering capitalism. That is the real debate, not these other clash of civilizations between religions or between men and women, but actually it's between two models of economic development. So this is not to argue against capitalism in any way whatsoever. I'm a firm believer in enterprise and investment and reward, etc. But it is to argue that the rules need to change radically. And those of you who are following the debacle around the bank HSBC at the moment, which is going on a global basis, it's just another example. There are lots of examples at the moment that one can point to about changing the rules. And so much of that comes back to a cultural change as well. So my fifth point then I've already talked about is that in order to understand those four systems changes, the fifth system change, which is evolution, adaptation, and learning, is absolutely crucial. And I talk quite a lot about the way we need to change courses and universities and schools, etc., and the sort of people that we need to develop and the sort of skills that we need to be teaching in universities. And most universities, of course, have business schools. Most of those business and management courses that they teach, that I've taught on, thinking that I was a change agent over the last 30 years, lots of places all over the world, I don't think we've been as successful as we should have been. We really need to start again, because most of our business and management courses on a global basis merely support the current status quo and the model that we have at the moment, which is masculine and rapacious, and is not going to take us well to the end of this century. So we really need to rethink business and management. And that's why I no longer want to work on corporate responsibility specifically. Indeed, my title here was on sustainable enterprise. I want to move to another place. I want to talk about political economy. Because unless we can make the case for, and I go back to that high-level report from the UN in 2012, unless I can make the case for me working with biologists, complex systems analysts, road planners, etc., which is how we should be teaching, unless I can make that case, we're not going to solve the problems by merely tinkering with the model of capitalism, which is what we were trying to do with a lot of corporate responsibility initiatives, or with tinkering with courses, or by just giving people a course on sustainable development in business and management. So I don't think that myself and many of the people who've written wonderful credits for my book have failed, who include the leaders of some of the world's largest corporate systems initiatives. You mentioned Georg Kell, UN Global Compact, about to stand down after 15 years. John Elkington, you'll know, John Ruggie at Harvard, etc. All of us have been engaged in this work. It's not that we think we've done wrong. It's not that we think that making corporations more transparent, accountable, and getting them to report was a bad idea. It was a very good idea, but we've done that much rather than this much, and we need to move to a higher level, hence this particular approach. So, what am I hoping for? And I am coming to an end now. I've argued that these 5 system changes are, first of all, they're happening anyway. The thing that they need to happen faster in order that we get to the end of the century. But I'm arguing that they are ineluctable and nascent anyway, so they will happen, and they will leave some of us as dinosaurs, as throwbacks to the past. This is the end of an industrial model of capitalism that has to change. We're into a very different way of working. But this challenges all of us to think in a different way. And particularly those of us like me who are at the top of the heap. I'm a white, relatively healthy man. And one of the things we know about social mobility and change is not just that you give space to other people, but those who have power stand down and move aside. That's what I hope I'm doing with this, and that's what I hope for this century. I'll stop there because I've talked for 35, 40 minutes. your own Q&A? Yes. Okay. Whatever. Hello. Nice to see you again.
Yes, good to see you again, and a very, very interesting talk. A little bit on the ambitious side, but as it needs to be. But could you be a bit more specific, just on the last of your systems changes? What, a bit more detail on what you think we academics need to do differently in what we put in our courses and how we teach them?
Okay, can I go to the beginning of your question? I'm not being ambitious. I think I'm reflecting what's happening anyway. Those people who don't recognise what I'm talking about are those people who haven't seen it yet, or for whom the wave is going to wash over them and drown them. It's a bit like people who don't recognise that China is the dominant economy this century, get real. It's a bit like people who don't recognise that climate change science, 97% of climate change scientists agree, is real. They're going to be washed aside, whatever happens. So it's not me being ambitious. I think I'm being analytical. Second part of your question. As I said, I had a privilege of going back and reading things, and I think that some of the shibboleths on which we base our education, we have failed to read them in full. So I've quoted Darwin, for instance, and said that that is universally misquoted and misunderstood, and I think the same is true for Karl Marx. And I'll quote somebody else at this point. Some of you will have read or looked at Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 20th Century. Anybody? You must have seen the debate that's been going on, where he showed, incontrovertibly, in a book that's this thick, years of work, that if you had wealth, you got wealthier. In other words, wealth distribution, social mobility wasn't happening. In other words, if you start rich, you remain rich and you get richer, because you have more choices, basically. But what he did was to support with evidence that hypothesis. That's why his book is so important. But towards the end of the book, he has a whole chapter called Resurrecting the Idea of Political Economy. And political economy has in the last 20 years under neoliberalism been regarded as rather left or neo-Marxist, etc. And I'm with him and the UN report that I quote on trying to resurrect the idea of political economy. In other words, connecting economics with society, because the model we have at the moment thinks, and I'm not just quoting Piketty, but also various other people, that we think of neoliberalism actually as a form of religious fundamentalism. In fact, if you read the literature, it comes out as higher and more truthful than religion, because it cannot fail the market. And therefore, to question it means you probably are mad or insane, because markets always work, don't they? I heard somebody here only yesterday saying this on the radio from a political party. I thought, my God. And that's strange, isn't it, when you think about it, that an economic philosophy, which is apparently based on science but isn't, is a form of religious fundamentalism. So I'm with Piketty. So does that help? So I want to re-establish connectivity between courses. I want to demolish business and management schools as they are. I want them to start again and rethink in the way that my colleague Nick Barter has done here with the MBA. He's just started with a lot of help from people like me and Jeremy and the centre to do that, but actually it's getting increased students. I'm about to go to another university where they've asked me to, in Britain, because I'm also leaving here, lost 2 directors this week, where they've asked me to completely reform the whole business and management school on the basis of what I've written in my book. And at the moment they're there, I've got to move them to there, and I've said I'll give it a go. And the Vice-Chancellor's behind me, but it's a massive task. And I know I'm swimming upstream, but that's my next task, my next book, is to do that. And I'll let you know. I'll come back in 2 years and tell you if I've gone mad. I'm going to avoid you, Neil, for a moment, unless it's a very short question. I'm going to go here. Sorry to be rude.
To learn, we have to also unlearn and relearn. Is it crisis that creates the catalyst, or how do we push a person towards new learning?
It's a great question, and I talk about this in the book because I've argued that actually most change is not really revolutionary. when you look at it over a longer time scale. We tend to like the idea of revolution and massive upheaval. And we tend also, because of Marx, but also because of Hobbes, various other people, to think that change has to be conflictual. I'm arguing that the 5 changes that I'm talking about are happening naturally, and a bit like I Ching, they're systems changes which are ineluctably happening and slowly. It doesn't have to be conflictual, and that if the collaborative century is going to work, it's because that is the wave moving in that direction anyway. There obviously will be moments of enormous conflict. So ISIS and Boko Haram is another example, but also politics and the way politicians talk to each other in Parliament House here is very conflictual. It doesn't have to be like that. So does that half answer your question?
I wonder if your health issues and my health issues might have been a catalyst for us learning better ways.
Well, I wasn't going to mention my health issues, but yes, when you read page 3 of the book, I say that I was told that I had an incurable disease 4 years ago, and I'm still here, and that writing the book has helped me to think differently about life. And it certainly does give you a different perspective, doesn't it? But I'm still here 4 years later, by the way. And quite healthy, thank you very much. But it's true that at the point at which you're confronted with the idea of death, it does make you look at life differently. And one of the problems, and I've written about this in the book quite a lot, is that our post-war baby boom generation thought that we had permanence, our generation, I knock the idea of sustainability on the head, by the way, in the book. I think it's a misnomer, literally. We thought we had increased longevity forever. We did. Our generation got older and older. We had increased wealth. We thought we were going to live forever. We had healthcare systems that were introduced, etc., etc. We've had a marvellous time, us rich, affluent people, and we invented the idea of sustainability. Knock it on the head. Let's start talking about impermanence and resilience and adaptation. So I'm trying not to use the word sustainable anymore, but it's been part of my life for 30 years. So we have a problem with that, not definitionally, but also culturally, with the idea of sustainability. Sorry.
I just had a question about whether you've had any observations of, you've spoken about university education. Have you made any observations about predictions and changes to primary school and high school education? Because I'm a parent of a primary school age child, and I have major concerns that the traditional teaching hasn't changed since I was a child, and it's not really preparing our children for the next wave of change that you're discussing.
I don't want to repeat myself. Can I leave that as a rhetorical question, as a comment? Thank you.
That's great to see you with your mouth. Can you tell, so you're talking about the fact that these changes are happening. Do you want to share a few more of the green shoots that you're seeing? And particularly, I mean, we're here in an Australian context. Are there green shoots that you're seeing of these 5 things in our context?
I don't want to be specific, partly because one of the problems we have is if I start talking about specific examples, we could be here to the end of the day. And my previous 26 books were about the kind of green shoots and, case studies on a company that's decided to do this, that, and the other. You could talk to your neighbour here, Chris, who saved $1 million last year in the energy bill, not by being a greenie, but just by being efficient with the energy for Mater Hospital, for instance. And I'm sure if we went round the room, we could find examples like that. So I don't want to go down that track, and there's lots of evidence you can find of alternative ways. I am arguing in the book, though, that these green shoots aren't enough. We need systems change. We need to think about them. We need to approach the problems differently.
With this change that's coming, as we're talking about the 21st century, does it recognise the culture that seems to exist in global economies, that lowest price is best and value doesn't matter? And that where everything goes on the lowest cost, and so there are a lot of inequalities around the world depending on what country is manufacturing, whether it's an impoverished nation, it's being developed by the Western world for their supermarkets. How do you balance trying what we just returned, you couldn't make work was so bad, you couldn't, expensive furniture. So how do you reverse all of this, and is that an economic philosophy that we should put in place to make us more true to our own identities and keep our own skills and cultures intact, rather than just going and having this evaluation of what value is in the cheapest price?
I'm also going to reply that that was a great comment, and it was semi-rhetorical. I'm going to repeat in that all of those issues I understand. I think the problem is the starting point, that if we start, as many of my colleagues do, including some of my previous books, if you start by saying these are the enormous challenges, how do we solve these enormous boulders, how do we get past them? So I would start somewhere else. In my book before last, I started by talking about the Chinese Politburo and said, here is the essential problem. 2 years ago, 9 besuited men took over the Chinese Politburo. 9 men. So that's why I talk about the problem, the gender problem, the masculinity, as systems problems, right? When I look at the 2, I've just been away and I've just come back here, and I look at the Premier who's just been dethroned here, and I look at his counterpart in Canberra, I see 2 aggressive white men, and I see systems change happening. So unless we address issues like the collaborative economy, unless we address issues like misogyny, unless we address issues like the organisations not delivering what we want, we're not going to be able to solve any of the problems that I quite rightly think that you're talking about, that I have previously written about at length and talked about, and same with this guy here. This is what I've spent 30 years going into MBA classrooms saying, you know, guess what? Unilever and Paul Polman, have you heard about him? You know what they're doing? That they've halved their carbon footprint over the last 10 years. Isn't it brilliant? Everybody rushes off and looks at Unilever. And of course it was Interface, the car pick company that I was using as a case study, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. We can all think of these things. I'm much more interested in those much larger issues at the moment, my stage. But that's not to devalue your... Neil, I must let you ask a question. I'll come to you.
I have many directions I could go. I'm going to go to the feminine.
Right.
I met you shortly before you were diagnosed. And
yes.
Shortly after, and you changed in that moment. I also have met Jeremy. I also saw Jim Bendel in this room.
Yep.
What I've seen with the 3 of you is a change in your worldview based on an evolution, conscious evolution, and in some cases unconscious evolution, through different stages of human development, which are well documented in spiral dynamics in integral theory. What I'm seeing in you is the reflection of the dialogue that I've been trying to have in Brisbane for 10 or 15 years, which is...
Good on you, Neil.
Transdisciplinary. I'm not opposed to saying
No. It's good.
Transdisciplinary, challenging institutions to step up. And what I'm now seeing in you is stepping out, as I did about 5 or 10 years ago, because it can't be done from inside those institutions with that level of thinking. I agree with you that emergence is happening. It's about how do we facilitate emergence. And I wonder, have you looked at things like theory U, letting go and letting come? Have you looked at dialogic circles, various other methods for how to involve people? Because the relationship is the critical element here, as I was discussing when Martin was in the room talking about shiitake mushrooms 2 years, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And I was talking about we in this room could become the ecosystem to change it. So I'm just reflecting on that collectively.
I'll answer.
Feminine crucible.
The answer is I agree with your analysis, but I disagree with your action, in that by writing this and by going back into education, I'm staying inside, because I think we're on the cusp of change. I think there are enough people who now know what I'm talking about for us to actually push these 5 systems changes. I don't need to be outside, I can be inside. And on the large systems change, I'm part of a large systems change research group around the world that works in South Africa, the US, Stockholm, etc. And we're just about to publish a special issue of the journal that I've edited for a long time, the Journal of Corporate Citizenship, on large systems change. And one of the articles is by Otto Scharmer, the author of Systems U. So look out for that, because I think you'll love it. So we've been working on this for about a year, 2 years. The Stockholm Resilience Centre, South African Food Labs, various people, networking action around the world. It's really exciting and interesting stuff. So yeah, but I think we can do this internally. We must not go outside now. We must be entryists and go inside and say this stuff is happening anyway. Let's move it forward. Yes.
Okay, so I want to pick up on the way that you're talking about the levels of change that need to take place. I've been getting a National Greens magazine, the two of them, for the last couple of years, and they're documenting the green shoots that you talk about, all sorts of local alternative organisations. But I think they're part of what I think is actually a systems change, where the kind of ethos that they're espousing is about the sharing economy. And yet, you know, they're businesses, they're sustainable, and they're quite resilient because they have to go through a lot to keep going. And I've been reading continuously about these companies, so I'm interested in writing about them. So I'm wondering whether it's either or. I mean, aren't we talking about different levels of where things are happening as well? You know, this is a local, grassroots, etc. But it's not as though they've got a narrow frame. They have a broad frame, but they can't operate at that. I mean, you know, in terms of your positivity notion, the media represents negativity across the board in this area. We never hear these stories, other than, you know, selecting out the
Nari, I'm not arguing anymore that this is either or that it's dichotomous. I'm arguing that these things are happening anyway, and the green shoots that you talk about is an inevitability. In fact, some of the feedback that I got from a whole lot of people, including people like Mark Moody-Stewart, former chair of Shell, was that this is happening anyway, that we are really moving into a completely different space. And if you don't understand the new ways of cooperation, you're going to get left behind. I mean, companies that don't understand this and universities that don't understand this will be left for dead. So I think this is happening. So it's not either or. I think that sharing economy. I talk about an initiative that I was a bit involved in the UK, which is setting up the farmers market movement, which now, I don't know, has 500 markets across the UK. It's been going about 20 years, etc., as part of that initiative, as part of that. So I think these things are happening anyway. So it's not just me being positive about green shoots. I think the forest is growing everywhere. Whoops, that's mixing it a bit, isn't it? Yes. What time should we stop, by the way? What's the problem?
25%.
Sorry?
25.
25, okay, we're right.
When you're talking about, I hear the word systems. Behind that, I wonder if you talk about policies, because policies seem to drive systems, or policies are derived from an educated point of view or input that comes in. And policies can be fairly rigid. They can actually impact on our knowledge of sustainability, or the ability to sustain a particular direction, has to do with the policy process, and policies that government formulate, and policies that business formulate, and policies that other communities formulate. So do you relate that back to policies?
Yes, but I had the privilege, after writing lots of books about changing policies and about instrumentalism and about initiatives on transparency and reporting and stuff, I had the privilege to go back and look in much more depth. But I'm arguing, actually, that maybe policies is the wrong word, that these things, that actually we are developing policies that are in tune with these 5 systems changes, but that they're much slower and they're unseen, and that the forces of inertia are vast. And going back to Nairi's point there, the forces of inertia are enormous. So the mining industry, any industry that takes stuff out of the Earth's lithosphere, is going to be a force of inertia, is going to try to slow down these inevitable 5 systems changes. Any person that's employed in any of those industries is naturally going to slow the change down, because they're beneficiaries of the status quo. They're not going to want it to change. And they tend, of course, most of those industries, up until now, to be dominated by white men. So that's also a major problem, not just the way in which they operate, but actually the people in them as well.
You recommend actually getting an understanding of what policies are and then challenging them and interrogating them, subjecting them to contestability, confronting them, because most of us, there are policies that are indirect and direct, and a lot of times we don't know what the policies are, but I think we need to have an action or a state of challenge.
Yes, and secrecy is a very, very big issue. You know about TTIP and all the transatlantic and the trade, the coming agreements in services as well, that actually is very secret processes that most people don't know much about. Quite extraordinarily undemocratic, that allow corporations to sue governments for lost earnings. You've got the case of Philip Morris and tobacco at the moment going through the Hong Kong courts. You must know about that because of plain packaging, etc. But there are lots of cases like that around the world. So yes, transparency and openness is absolutely crucial to understanding this and understanding not just the science but the policies. So yes, I hope that by talking at the level that I'm talking, that I empower people so that they feel more emboldened and less miserable about the future. That's very important. Does that make sense?
Oh, there's another book called The Rational Optimist. I forgot the author, but I'm sure you know him.
Yeah.
And that also involves you to appreciate the benefits about current standards.
Thank you, anyway. Yep, somebody... Yeah. Hello. Yes, sir.
You were speaking in the mid-60s or early 60s. Would you have picked neoliberal capitalism being one of those inexorable forces that we have no choice about heading down that direction?
Fascinating, fascinating.
Do you see the seeds of some of your great systems? Do you see the seeds of their own self-destruction?
I think that the history of the introduction of that idea is something that we need to do more reading on. And the person I learned most reading the history of neoliberalism was this guy, Tony Judd, that I referred to earlier, this guy who died about 2 years ago. And I hadn't realized, reading him and then reading the history of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and all the Chicago economists, actually, I don't know whether you're experts in this, but actually if you go back to their histories, as it were, it's absolutely fascinating. Friedrich Hayek was born in a small village outside Vienna, in a mountain, etc. He was brought up to believe that the city was a dangerous and evil place and that complex urban places gave people communism. It's where they came together and they collaborated and they came up with these economic ideas about sharing stuff and particularly about planning. So actually, if you go back and look at the history, and Milton Friedman and a whole lot of them, actually their histories are really fascinating. I need to read more on how that was introduced and the coup. I spend quite a lot of time talking about Chile, because you'll know that 9/11 in Chile is 9/11/73. It was the date of the overthrow of the elected Marxist government, supported by the CIA and ITT, a large corporation. And now that all the files have become available, they're open to everybody, you'll see that people like Kissinger, still alive, much heralded, says, why should we let a bunch of Marxists ruin, etc. All the files are there. He's completely derogatory about democracy and about the form of public engagement that existed in Chile. Then, of course, Pinochet, whose guru was Friedrich Hayek, who was then applauded by Margaret Thatcher, even though he was up on human rights abuses. 30,000 people disappeared. So that 9/11, 30,000 people disappeared because of a form of economic fundamentalism, I argue in the book. There's much work to be done on that. How did they affect that revolution? How did they make it happen on a global basis? I don't know enough. I need to read more, but I think it's fascinating. But if you read people like Colin Crouch, you may know, his latest book, book 1, was The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. He argues that, of course, the corporations that we have at the moment are the main supporters of this model of capitalism because they are the main beneficiaries. And as those corporations have been taken over by their managers, who are now rewarding themselves with billions, it's those corporations that actually have neoliberalism embedded in them most. I suggest you also go and read Colin Crouch. Very good analysis indeed. And by the way, an easy reader in terms of economics as well. Do you know Colin Crouch? Good stuff. And Tony Judd as well. Brilliant.
Thank you very much for that. When you're talking about thinking, Do you look at the role of think tanks, which of course, in terms of looking at the look at things, proliferated hugely since Van Hayek and Milton Friedman in the 1930s set up and organised free modern society. So, you know, and the second part of the question is, what about the counter NGO think tanks? Do they have a role in creating new forms of thinking that the neoliberal, the neoliberal, there's been a revolution in terms of the neoliberal thinking and the way they've been thinking?
Well, the Mont Pelerin Society, of course, which Milton Friedman and Frederick Hayek was part of, was a bunch of neoliberalists who meet every year in Switzerland. But I go back to Nairi's question, and one here as well. I think we're getting new organisational forms. And I think a lot of these think tanks, whether they're on the left or the right, are part of this new form, which is possible because of social media in particular. So I think, watch this space. If you spend time in China, as I try to every year, you'll see that actually the democratic debate there is enormous. It doesn't matter how much the Chinese Communist Party tries to close down the internet, because you can't get Twitter and Google in China, etc. But people are using other servers in other countries to have massive discussions about change. So a large monolithic government, Chinese government, is unable to stop that debate. That is really, really interesting. I think that's happening in all countries, but it's happening for good and for bad. So the pornographers and the murderers can use it at the same time as the others. So perhaps it's for those people like you to seize the power and to make it a technology for good. But I think organisational forms are changing, is what I'm saying. So the network society is absolutely fascinating, that stuff, I think. Just as a bit of a joke there, I was just there 2 weeks ago, and it turned out that most of the foreigners, expatriate community there, and a lot of Chinese people were using servers in other countries to get into Google, and then they discovered that most of the servers they were using were in North Korea. So that's now been closed down, really, and that was somebody from Accenture, a large consultancy company, who told me that. So there's some real ironies here as well. Yeah.
My question is regards to human nature, the fundamentals of human nature. It just sounds like your view is somewhat humanist. How do you view human nature, basically? Is it like optimistic? Are you, because all this change, this necessary change that needs to take place, I feel it assumes that people are inherently good or willing to make, to share, to...
I do come down on the side of the angels in that we have a moral imperative in the book. We have a moral imperative to look after each other, but that isn't the answer to your question. What I say in the book, and you can read it and come back to me, is about adaptation, evolution, and learning. That at moments like this, we can learn and we can therefore adapt. So forget good or bad, because actually they're pretty subjective relative terms, aren't they?
Yeah.
But actually our ability to adapt and learn from that and understand evolutionary past is what will save us. Nothing else will. Now, whether that means that there's a different moral good in the future or not, I don't know. Do I have a set of values? Yes, the book is embedded with them, even though I don't talk about them very much, but I wouldn't be talking about misogynism if I didn't think that misogynism was evil. So you can hear my values there on my sleeve. And I talked about the world being more peaceful than it's ever been before. Well, some people don't want it to be peaceful. They want the idea of conflict, continuous conflict. So you can hear my values again, can't you? So are people inherently evil? I'm not going to answer that question. That's a religiosity question rather than a question of evolution, adaptation, and learning.
I think it was more related to scarcity, how we deal with scarcity going forward.
It's easy peasy. There's plenty, Gandhi, there's plenty for everyone's needs, etc. It's just a question of how we divide the cake. Read Piketty on wealth in the 20th century. All the statistics are there. There's stacks of resources and the stacks of wealth. We have a system that's stacked against us at the moment. I'm very optimistic about that. I don't have a problem there at all. I point again to Chris here managing to save $1 million on the energy bill for the Mater Hospital because of efficiency, just by efficiency. There's so much that can be done just by better management, apart from actually changing the systems as well. So yeah, I'm an optimist. We can do it if we can learn. If we can't learn, this is the last century. Do I think we can learn? Yes, I think we can. That's what the book says. Read it and tell me I'm wrong. But you'll be dead in, 50 years anyway. And so will I. So I won't know whether I'm right or wrong. Next, anybody else? And then we might wrap up. Ilka.
I don't know if I can go linearly. There might be lots of resources, but I haven't heard any conversation about nature, for want of a better word. And there is a decreasing amount of species, and the things that I understand give us awe or wonder, which are essential to culture and spirit. And I think that's also essential to feminisation and the other. So I'm just wondering if you approach. I haven't heard any conversation about that.
That's why I keep doing this. This is the thing on which we survive. This is nature. This is, you want to call it nature. I happen to call it globality. I call it Earth-centric. Actually, I used the term planet home. In 2004, I wrote a piece on planet home as one word, the idea of planet home. Or as Barbara Ward said, she talked about spaceship Earth, remember, back in the 1960s, etc. So you choose your language. But that understanding and connectivity with this one shared space is essential if we're going to get out of this century. And that requires us not just to have a mechanistic or technocratic understanding of how the planet works, but as I said, it's about us understanding that this is something to love in the way you would love your children. You said you were a tree hugger the other day. Absolutely. We have to get the whole planet, particularly technocratic economists, to understand that actually that's how people survive, not just through exchange.
Well, it's just in one of the chapters in The Necessary Transition, I don't know who the author was, but he talked about, he used that beautiful analogy of a museum exhibition.
Oh yes, Richard Castles. It was here, of course.
At the beginning of time, when he looked at humanity and looked at all these different exhibitions, that he actually could see this exponential rate of the environment or nature, just for use of a country term, decreasing with the evolution of humanity. And I see that too in terms of, we are losing species, not just climate change, but in terms of environmental health. And I'm not being a miserabilist, but I just being a realist in that sense, because it's not talked about. It's kind of not that.
I think we've always lost species. That was the wrong thing to say, wasn't it?
It seems a little anthropocentric.
Now, if you want to...
We're intervening there.
I get one sentence, I want to finish. It is possible to follow that apocalyptic vision that, yes, we're killing species, that we're going to get more than 2 degrees rise in temperature on a global basis, etc., that population's going to explode, that we're going to run food scarcity, etc. It is possible. I started in my last book, book 1, called Sea Change, with Sandra Waddock, on that basis. This book, I start from the perspective that I understand all that, but I've got to find a positive, non-miserabilist way out of that, although I recognise exactly what you're saying, and I'm arguing that the 5 systems changes, if we push them and open the door for them, they will help us solve these problems. Does that help?
Don't worry. Ladies and gentlemen, can you put your hands together for Al?